I wasn't supposed to be home that early. It was one of those rare days when the meeting ended sooner than expected, and I decided to skip the gym. As I walked up to the front door, I could hear faint sounds from inside, Lisa's voice, but quieter than usual. I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob, something in my gut telling me to listen first. "David, I can't do this right now. Dan might be home soon," she whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of excitement and fear. David, her professor. The name hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the world around me start to tilt. I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the door, trying to convince myself that I'd misheard. "Tonight? I don't know. I'll find an excuse, but we have to be careful." The words sliced through me, each one sharper than the last. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Lisa, my wife, my partner of 10 years, was having an affair, and not just with anyone but with David, her charismatic college professor. The man she'd mentioned in passing over dinner, always with that spark in her eye that I hadn't noticed until now. I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was colder than that, more calculated. Confronting her now wouldn't change anything. She'd lie, make excuses, and turn the tables on me somehow. I knew her too well. So I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked away as if I'd never heard a thing. My mind was already working, plotting my next move. Destroying her lover wasn't just about revenge, it was about taking control of the situation. If David thought he could take what was mine, he was sorely mistaken. I would ruin him, strip him of everything he held dear, just like he had done to me. I wasn't sure how yet, but I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't going to end with a simple confrontation. No, I was going to make sure David regretted ever crossing paths with Lisa, and she would learn just how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine. The door to our house felt heavier when I finally opened it, stepping into the familiar warmth of our living room. Lisa looked up from the couch, her phone slipping into the pocket of her jeans as she flashed me a smile, forced, strained. "You're home early," she said, her voice just a little too casual. "Yeah, the meeting wrapped up sooner than I thought." I forced a smile, keeping my tone light. "Thought I'd surprise you." Little did she know the real surprise was yet to come. The days after that phone call blurred together in a haze of false smiles and calculated moves. Every word Lisa said to me felt rehearsed, her eyes always darting away when I tried to catch her gaze. She didn't know that I knew, and I intended to keep it that way. For now, at night, when she thought I was asleep, she'd slip out of bed and tiptoe downstairs, her phone glowing in the dark. She'd sit on the couch texting furiously, her face illuminated by the soft blue light. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence between us grow louder until it was deafening. I'd always thought of myself as a reasonable man, someone who could handle problems with calm and logic. But this was different. This wasn't just a problem to solve, this was a betrayal, and every time I pictured Lisa in David's arms, a white-hot rage boiled inside me, threatening to consume everything. One night, as I lay awake, listening to the faint clicks of her phone, I made a decision. Confronting her would be too easy. It wouldn't change anything, wouldn't erase what she'd done. I needed something more. I needed to hit her where it hurt. And David, he was the key. The next morning I started researching David. Not just his academic background, but his life outside of the university. It didn't take long to find out that he worked at a tech startup in town, one that I was already familiar with. They had a reputation for innovation, but also for having high turnover rates. Perfect. Over the next few weeks I made some calls and reached out to contacts, and before long, I'd secured a position at the same company. It wasn't difficult, my resume was solid, and they were eager to bring me on board. Of course, Lisa had no idea. As far as she knew, I was still working at my old job, same hours and the same routine. "Something on your mind?" she asked one evening, glancing up from her laptop. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the remnants of dinner between us. Her tone was casual, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She was worried about what, I wasn't sure. Maybe she could sense the distance growing between us, the way I'd stopped trying to reach for her in bed at night, how I didn't ask about her day anymore. "Just work," I said, forcing a smile. "Busy week." She nodded, her relief almost palpable, and went back to her screen. I watched her for a moment, feeling a strange mix of love and resentment twisting inside me. How did we get here? How did the woman I'd married, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, turn into a stranger? But those thoughts were dangerous. They'd only distract me from what I needed to do, so I buried them deep and focused on the task at hand. On my first day at the new job, I made it a point to stay under the radar. I kept my interactions with David brief and professional, though every time I saw him, It took everything in me not to lash out. He was exactly what I expected, charming, confident, and utterly oblivious to the chaos he'd created in my life. I began watching him closely, observing his patterns and his relationships with others at the company. It wasn't long before I started noticing cracks in his facade. He was careless and too comfortable in his position, and that would be his downfall. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Late one night, I stumbled across a series of emails between David and one of his female colleagues. They weren't as explicit as the messages I'd overheard between him and Lisa, but they were suggestive enough. Enough to raise eyebrows, enough to hint at impropriety. I saved the emails, compiling them with the other bits of information I'd gathered. It was all starting to come together, like pieces of a puzzle, and I could see the endgame in sight. This wasn't just about exposing the affair anymore. This was about destroying David's career, his reputation, and his life. The way he had destroyed mine. And Lisa, well, she would be collateral damage. The satisfaction I felt as I compiled the evidence was a twisted kind of relief. Each new piece of dirt I dug up on David was like a small victory, a step closer to the revenge I craved. I was meticulous, careful not to let emotion cloud my judgment. This wasn't just about anger anymore, it was strategy, pure and simple. At work, I kept my head down, playing the role of the diligent new hire. I made sure to stay on David's good side, even going out of my way to make small talk in the break room or share a beer after hours with the team. He never suspected a thing. Why would he? To him, I was just another colleague, another face in the crowd. If only he knew. My plan was simple. Expose David's inappropriate relationships at work, and frame it as a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. The emails I'd collected were just the tip of the iceberg. I started discreetly recording conversations, catching snippets of flirtatious banter, off-color jokes, and the occasional careless comment that could be twisted into something more sinister. It was amazing how easy it was to manipulate the situation. All it took was a few well-placed words and a bit of encouragement to get people talking. Soon, whispers about David's conduct began circulating around the office, small enough to go unnoticed by management at first, but loud enough to stir doubt among his colleagues. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, content with the knowledge that I was the one pulling the strings. Then came the perfect opportunity. A company party, a casual gathering at a local bar, with everyone letting loose after a tough quarter. I knew David would be there, and I knew he'd have a few too many drinks. It was his habit after all. I made sure to stick close, keeping my phone ready, waiting for him to slip up. It didn't take long. After a few rounds, David's usual charm turned sloppy, his words slurred, his actions more brazen. I saw him corner one of the younger female employees, leaning in too close, his hand lingering on her arm longer than necessary. She laughed it off, uncomfortable but too polite to push him away. I caught it all on video. The next morning, I sent an anonymous email to HR, attaching the video and a carefully crafted message that outlined David's history of inappropriate behavior. I included the emails, the recordings, everything I had gathered. I made it clear that this wasn't just a one-time incident. It was a pattern, and if they didn't act, it would be on them. The response was swift. Within days, an internal investigation was launched. David was called into meetings, his face pale, his usual confidence shaken. He tried to play it off, blaming misunderstandings and office gossip, but the evidence was too damning. Watching him squirm was everything I'd hoped it would be. I didn't feel guilty, not even for a second. He deserved this. He deserved every bit of it. But Lisa, she didn't see it that way. It was late one night when she finally confronted me. I was sitting in the living room, sipping a whiskey, savoring the taste of victory, when she stormed in, her face twisted with anger and fear. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice trembling. I looked up at her, trying to feign ignorance, but she wasn't buying it. She threw her phone onto the coffee table, and I saw the email she had received, a forwarded message from a mutual friend, detailing the rumors swirling around David's downfall. "You think I didn't know?" she hissed, tears welling up in her eyes. "You think I wouldn't find out? You're destroying him, Dan. For what, to get back at me?" I stood up, setting the glass down slowly. "He deserved it, Lisa. He's been messing around with more than just you. He's a predator, and he's getting what's coming to him." Her hands shook as she raked them through her hair. "And what about us, Dan? What about our family? Do you really think this will fix anything?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was, I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd been so consumed by my need for revenge that I hadn't considered what it would do to us. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you keep going down this path, I'm done. I'm leaving. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. For the first time I saw the full extent of the damage I'd caused. It wasn't just David's life I was tearing apart, it was ours. And maybe that was something I couldn't fix. But it was too late to turn back now. Lisa's words echoed in my mind long after she stormed out of the living room. The house felt too quiet, too empty without the sound of her voice, even if that voice had been filled with anger and pain. I sat there staring at the whiskey in my hand, wondering how everything had spiraled so far out of control. I had wanted to protect us, our marriage, our family, but instead, I'd lit a fire that was now threatening to burn everything down. Lisa's ultimatum hung over me like a dark cloud. If I continued with my plan, I would lose her. The woman I had built a life with, the woman I still loved despite everything, would walk away for good. But how could I stop now? David was so close to losing everything, just as I had. The investigation was wrapping up, and the whispers around the office had turned into full-blown accusations. Every time I saw him, I could see the fear in his eyes, the desperation as he tried to hold on to the crumbling pieces of his career. The satisfaction I had felt earlier was starting to fade, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. This wasn't the victory I had imagined. Instead of feeling triumphant, I felt hollow, as if the revenge I had craved so badly had taken something vital from me. Lisa avoided me over the next few days. Our conversations were limited to brief exchanges about practical matters, groceries, bills, and who would pick up our daughter Emma from school. The distance between us grew wider with every passing hour, and I could see it in her eyes when she looked at me. The love that had once been there was fading, replaced by something colder, more resigned. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that I could stop, that we could fix this, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. How do you apologize for tearing apart the life you built together? How do you ask for forgiveness when you're not sure you even deserve it? One evening after Emma was asleep, Lisa finally broke the silence. She stood in the doorway of our bedroom, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "about everything." I looked up from the papers I'd been pretending to read, my heart pounding in my chest. "And," she sighed, stepping into the room, "I can't do this anymore, Dan. I can't live in a house filled with secrets and lies. I know I'm not innocent in all of this, but what you've done, it's destroying us. It's destroying you." I didn't know what to say. She was right, of course. Every move I'd made in the last few months had been calculated and strategic, but at what cost? The man I saw in the mirror every morning was a stranger, driven by vengeance and paranoia. "I just wanted to protect us," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "I wanted to make sure he couldn't hurt us again." Lisa shook her head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But you're the one who's hurting us, Dan. Can't you see that? This obsession with David, it's eating you alive. And it's tearing me apart too." She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she twisted the wedding ring on her finger. "I'm leaving," she said, the words so soft I almost didn't hear them. "I can't stay here and watch you destroy yourself. And I can't stay in a marriage that's built on revenge." My heart stopped. This was it, the moment I'd feared but had been too stubborn to acknowledge. She was really leaving. "Lisa, please," I whispered, reaching out to her. "We can fix this. I'll stop, I swear I'll stop. We can go to therapy, we can talk about everything. Just, don't go." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with tears. "I wish it were that simple, Dan, but it's too late. You've already made your choice and I've made mine." The finality in her voice crushed me. I had thought that if I just let go of my need for revenge, I could somehow salvage what was left of our marriage. But the truth was I had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I'll stay until we figure out what's best for Emma," Lisa said, standing up. "But after that, I'm moving out." I watched her walk away, feeling the weight of my decisions press down on me like a heavy stone. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. I had thought I could control everything, but now I realized that in my quest for vengeance I had lost control of the one thing that truly mattered, my family. As I sat there in the darkened room, the silence closing in around me, I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. The answer, as painful as it was no. Because no matter what happened to David, I had already lost. The days that followed were a blur of tense conversations and quiet moments that felt like the calm before a storm. Lisa and I moved through the house like ghosts, each of us trying to avoid the other as much as possible. The decision had been made, but the reality of it hadn't fully sunk in yet. Every time I looked at her, I couldn't help but feel like I was watching something precious slip through my fingers, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hold on. Emma noticed the tension, of course. Kids always do. She asked questions, innocent ones that cut deeper than any argument. "Why are you and Mommy so quiet? What Are we still going to the park this weekend? Will everything be okay? I told her what I could, the lies twisting in my stomach like knives. Mommy and Daddy are just a little stressed right now, sweetie. Everything will be fine. We'll go to the park this weekend, I promise. But the truth was, nothing felt fine anymore. The house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now felt cold and sterile. And I knew that soon, it would be even emptier. Lisa spent most of her time making plans, talking to a lawyer, looking at apartments, and trying to figure out how to explain things to Emma without breaking her heart. I could see the toll it was taking on her, but I couldn't find the words to comfort her. How could I when I was the one responsible for all of this? Meanwhile at work, the fallout from David's scandal was reaching its peak. The investigation had concluded, and David was officially let go. The news spread quickly, and by the end of the day, everyone was talking about it. Some people were shocked, others weren't surprised at all, but no one knew the full story. No one knew that I had orchestrated his downfall from the shadows. As I packed up my things to leave that day, I felt an unexpected hollowness inside me. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To see him brought low, to know that he would pay for what he had done. But instead of feeling vindicated, all I felt was emptiness. There was no satisfaction in watching him walk out of the building, his shoulders slumped in defeat. There was no triumph in knowing that I had won, because in the end there were no winners here. Only casualties. That evening I found myself sitting alone in the living room, the house eerily quiet. Lisa was upstairs putting Emma to bed, and I could hear the faint sound of her voice as she read a bedtime story. I used to love those moments, the simple everyday routines that made up our life together, but now they felt like reminders of everything I was about to lose. I poured myself another drink, trying to drown out the thoughts swirling in my head, but it didn't help. No matter how much I tried to numb myself, the reality of what I had done was always there, staring back at. When Lisa finally came downstairs, she hesitated in the doorway, her eyes flickering to the glass in my hand. She looked tired, exhausted really. The weight of everything we'd been through was etched into her features, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago before life and betrayal and revenge had torn us apart. "We need to talk," she said quietly, stepping into the room. I nodded, setting the glass down. "I know." She sat down across from me, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything we hadn't said, everything we couldn't say. "I found a place," she said finally. "It's not far from here, so Emma can still go to the same school. I'll be moving out next week." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, but I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. That's good. For Emma." Lisa looked down at her hands, twisting the ring on her finger. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about everything that led us here. I'm not trying to absolve myself, I know I made mistakes. But Dan, you have to let this go. The anger, the need for revenge, it's destroying you." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her that I was justified, that David had deserved everything he had. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew she was right. "I don't know how," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I thought I could control it, that I could make things right by taking him down. But all I've done is ruin everything." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut me to the core. "You have to try, Dan. For Emma's sake, if nothing else. She needs her father. She needs you to be okay." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time I truly understood what I had done, not just to Lisa but to Emma, to our family. And I realized that if I didn't change, if I didn't find a way to let go, I would lose everything that mattered. "I'll try," I said, and this time I meant it. "I don't know how, but I'll try." Lisa nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. "That's all I'm asking." The conversation ended there, the future uncertain but clearer than it had been in a long time. As Lisa got up to leave the room, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't the ending I had wanted, but maybe it was the one I deserved. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. The morning Lisa moved out felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. I stood by the window, staring out at the driveway as the movers loaded the last of her things into the truck. Emma was at school, thankfully spared from witnessing this moment, though I knew we'd eventually have to explain everything to her. The thought made my chest tighten, but I pushed it aside. Today was hard enough as it was. Lisa moved through the house with quiet efficiency, her face set in a determined expression. We hadn't spoken much since our conversation in the living room a few nights ago. There wasn't much left to say. She was leaving, and I had no right to stop her. When the movers finished and the house was empty of her belongings, she turned to me in the foyer, holding a small box in her hands. It was the last thing to go, the final piece of her life here. "This is it," she said softly, her voice barely audible in the quiet house. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that would capture the weight of everything we'd been through, but all I could manage was, "I'll see you around." Lisa smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Yeah, I guess you will." For a moment we stood there in silence, both of us aware that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I could see the pain in her eyes but also a sense of resolve. She was ready to move on, to start over. And as much as it hurt, I knew I had to let her go. "I'm sorry, Lisa," I said finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "For everything. For what I did, for how I handled it all. I never wanted it to end like this." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression softening. "I know, Dan, and I'm sorry too, but we can't change the past. All we can do now is figure out how to move forward." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "Take care of yourself. And Emma. I'll always be here for her. For both of you." She reached out then, placing a hand on my arm. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. "I know you will, and I hope you find peace, Dan. For your sake, and for Emma's." I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that peace was something I could find after everything that had happened. But right now it felt like a distant dream. We shared one last look, a moment of understanding between two people who had once shared everything but were now going their separate ways. Then with a final squeeze of my arm she turned and walked out the door. I stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the spot where she had been. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence almost deafening. The life we had built together was gone, reduced to memories and empty rooms. But as much as it hurt, I knew this was the only way forward. Lisa deserved a chance to heal, to rebuild her life without the shadows of our past hanging over her. And maybe, in time, I could find a way to heal too. In the days that followed, I tried to focus on the things that mattered, my work, my time with Emma, and finding a new rhythm in this unfamiliar world. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of everything threatened to crush me, but I kept going, one step at a time because that was all I could do. One evening, about a week after Lisa moved out, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the sunset over the neighborhood. The sky was a brilliant mix of oranges and pinks, the kind of sunset that reminded you that life, despite everything, still held beauty. I thought about Lisa, about everything we had been through, and wondered what she was doing at that moment. Was she sitting in her new apartment, watching the sunset too? Or was she with Emma, helping her with homework or reading her a bedtime story? I hoped she was finding some semblance of peace, some small comfort in the quiet moments of her new life. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could find that peace too. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But I had to try, for Emma, for Lisa, and for myself. Because if there was one thing I had learned through all of this, it was that holding on to anger and revenge only led to more pain. Letting go was hard, but it was the only way forward. So as the last light of the day faded into darkness, I made a promise to myself. I would let go of the past, let go of the need for control and revenge, and focus on what really mattered, the future. It was uncertain, and it was scary, but it was also full of possibility. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The first morning without Lisa felt like waking up in a different world. The bed was cold and empty beside me, and the house was eerily quiet. Even the usual sounds of the neighborhood, cars passing by, birds chirping, seemed distant, muted. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon the energy to get up and face the day. But life had to go on, no matter how different it felt. Emma needed me to be strong, even if I didn't feel strong. So I pulled myself out of bed, went through the motions of making coffee, and started the day. Emma came downstairs a little later, rubbing her eyes sleepily. She looked so small in her pajamas, her hair a mess from sleep. When she saw me, her face lit up with a smile, and for a moment, everything felt almost normal. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile as I handed her a bowl of cereal. "Good morning, Daddy," she replied, her voice bright. But then she hesitated, her smile faltering. "Is Mommy coming back today?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. We'd explained to Emma that Lisa would be living in a new place, but the reality of it was still sinking in for her. For all of us. "No, sweetie," I said gently, crouching down beside her. "Mommy's going to be staying at her new apartment. But you'll see her soon, okay? And we'll still do lots of fun things together." She nodded slowly, processing the information. "Okay, can we go to the park today?" I smiled, relieved that she wasn't dwelling on the changes too much. "Of course. After breakfast we'll go." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activities, trips to the park, playing games and trying to keep Emma occupied and happy. but in the quiet moments, when she wasn't looking, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. The empty space where Lisa used to be was always there, a constant reminder of what I had lost. That evening, after I put Emma to bed, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the boxes Lisa had left behind. She had taken most of her things, but there were still a few odds and ends, photos, a couple of books, and small items that she hadn't had room for on the first trip. I knew I should pack them up and get them out of sight, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I picked up one of the framed photos, a picture of us on our wedding day. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. It felt like a lifetime ago. As I stared at the photo, memories flooded back, good memories from a time before everything had gone wrong. Our honeymoon in Hawaii, the birth of Emma, the quiet moments we'd shared in this very house. There had been love here once, real love, and it was painful to think about how far we'd drifted from that. But the past was the past. I couldn't change it, and I couldn't live in it either. I had to focus on the present, on being the best father I could be for Emma, and on finding a way to move forward with my life. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment. Lisa and I settled into a routine of co-parenting, and while it wasn't easy, we both did our best to make it work for Emma's sake. There were awkward moments, of course, handing her off on weekends, navigating holidays and school events, but we managed. And over time, the sting of separation began to dull, replaced by a quiet acceptance of our new reality. I threw myself into my work, hoping that keeping busy would help me avoid dwelling on the emptiness at home. It worked for the most part, but there were still nights when I found myself lying awake, wondering if I had made all the wrong choices, if I had pushed too hard, if there had been a way to save us that I had missed. One afternoon, about a month after Lisa moved out, I ran into her at the grocery store. It was the first time I'd seen her outside of our scheduled drop-offs and pickups, and the sight of her caught me off guard. She looked different, more relaxed somehow, as if the weight of everything we'd been through had lifted off her shoulders. "Hey," she said, giving me a small smile as she reached for a carton of milk. "Hey," I replied, awkwardly shifting my grocery basket in my hands. "How are you?" "I'm good," she said, and I could tell she meant it. "You?" I nodded. "Yeah, I'm getting there." There was a pause, a moment of silence that felt heavier than it should have. But it wasn't uncomfortable, just different. A new normal. "I'm glad you're doing okay," she said finally. "I really am, Dan." "Thanks," I said, feeling a warmth in her words that I hadn't felt in a long time. "You too." We exchanged a few more pleasantries, then went our separate ways. But as I walked to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Not in a way that would lead to reconciliation, too much had happened for that, but in a way that felt peaceful. Like maybe, just maybe, we were both starting to heal. Back at home, I sat on the porch and watched Emma play in the yard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of calm. The future was still uncertain, but it didn't scare me as much as it once had. As I watched my daughter laugh and run around, I realized that I wasn't as alone as I'd felt. I had Emma. I had my work. I had the chance to start over, to build something new out of the pieces of the life I'd once known. And that was enough. So, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, I made another promise to myself. I would take things one day at a time, focus on the present, and let the future unfold as it would. Because in the end, that was all any of us could do, keep moving forward, even when the path wasn't clear. And maybe, just maybe, that was the best way to find peace. The next time I saw Lisa was at Emma's school play. It was a big deal for our daughter. She'd been talking about it for weeks, rehearsing her lines over and over again until I could recite them in my sleep. Seeing her up on stage, dressed as a little sunflower, made everything else fade away for a while. The pride and joy in her face as she delivered her lines perfectly brought tears to my eyes. Lisa was there too, of course. We hadn't discussed it, but it was a given that both of us would be present for something this important. When I arrived, I saw her already seated in the front row, saving a spot for me beside her. She waved, smiling as if nothing had changed, as if we were still the picture-perfect family we used to be. I took my seat next to her, and for a while we focused solely on Emma. Every time she spoke, we exchanged proud glances, momentarily forgetting the tension between us. But when the play ended and the applause died down, reality came rushing back. We walked out of the school auditorium together, Emma between us, still buzzing with excitement. After a few minutes, she ran ahead to join her friends, leaving Lisa and me standing awkwardly in the parking lot. "So," Lisa started, breaking the silence. "She did great, didn't she?" "She was amazing," I agreed. "She's got a real talent for this." Lisa nodded, her smile fading slightly as the conversation shifted from Emma to us. "Listen, Dan, I think we should tea talk. I had been expecting this. Our interactions had been civil since the separation, but we hadn't really talked. Not about what had happened, or where we stood now. I knew this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. Yeah, I think so too, I said, bracing myself. We decided to go for a walk around the block, giving us some privacy while Emma played with her friends. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet as we walked side by side, not quite touching but close enough to feel the tension between us. I've been thinking a lot, Lisa began, her voice steady but laced with emotion, about everything that happened, and where we go from here. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. This was her moment to say whatever she needed to say, and I wasn't going to interrupt. I know I hurt you, Dan, she said, her voice breaking slightly. And I'm sorry, I'll always be sorry for that, but I've realized that we've both been hurting for a long time. We just didn't know how to deal with it. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. She was right, our marriage had been unraveling long before I discovered the affair. We had both been too caught up in our own worlds to notice the cracks forming between us. I've had a lot of time to think too, I admitted, and I know I wasn't the perfect husband. I made mistakes. Big ones, but I never wanted it to end like this. Lisa stopped walking and turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. Do you think there's any chance for us? To rebuild somehow? Her question hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility and regret. It was a question I had asked myself countless times since she left, and I still didn't have a clear answer. I don't know, Lisa, I said honestly. Part of me wants to believe we could, that we could find a way to fix what's broken. But I don't know if that's possible, not after everything. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The one who had shared my dreams and my life. The one I had lost. I understand, she whispered. I guess I just needed to hear it. We stood there in silence for a while, the distance between us feeling both vast and painfully close. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. We had to face the truth, no matter how hard it was. I think we both need to focus on Emma, I said finally, breaking the silence. She's what matters now, making sure she's okay, and that she feels loved and supported. That's our priority. Lisa nodded, wiping her tears away. You're right, she deserves that. And I want us to be good co-parents, Dan. I want to be able to work together, even if we can't be together. It was a painful truth, but a necessary one. We had to find a way to move forward for Emma's sake, if nothing else. I want that too, I agreed. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. As we made our way back to the school, I felt a strange sense of relief. The conversation had been hard, but it had also brought a sense of closure. We were finally facing the reality of our situation, and while it wasn't the outcome either of us had hoped for, it was something we could work with. When we reached the parking lot, Emma ran up to us, her face glowing with excitement. Daddy, did you see me? Did you see my performance? I scooped her up in my arms, smiling at her enthusiasm. You were amazing, sweetie. I'm so proud of you. Lisa joined in, praising Emma for her performance as we both showered her with affection. For a moment, we were united again. Not as husband and wife, but as parents who loved their daughter more than anything in the world. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to navigate this new reality. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be perfect. But we had something worth fighting for. As we said our goodbyes and Lisa drove away, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The future was still uncertain, and there were bound to be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could face whatever came next. Because no matter what happened between Lisa and me, one thing was clear, we both wanted the best for Emma. And that was something we could build on, one step at a time. A few weeks after our talk, the rhythm of my new life started to settle in. I focused on Emma and work, trying to fill the gaps that Lisa's absence had left. But despite my best efforts, there were nights when the quiet of the house felt unbearable, and the memories of what we once had haunted me. One of those nights, as I sat in the dimly lit kitchen, nursing a beer and staring blankly at the wall, my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another work email, but something made me glance at the screen. It was a text from Lisa. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a few seconds, unsure of what to say. We'd had our big conversation already, the one that was supposed to bring closure. What more was there to discuss? But something in me couldn't ignore her request. Sure, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. A few minutes later, my phone rang. I answered it, half expecting an emergency, but Lisa's voice on the other end was calm. Hey Dan, I know it's late, I just couldn't stop thinking about our last conversation. What about IIT? I asked, leaning back in my chair and closing my eyes, trying to anticipate where this was going. "I've been struggling with this, with everything, honestly," she said quietly. "I can't stop wondering if I made the right choice, leaving. If there was more we could have done to save us." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I'd been having the same thoughts, turning them over and over in my mind late at night. But hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way I hadn't been prepared for. "I've thought about that too," I admitted. "But Lisa, it's not just about saving us, it's about what's best for all of us, including Emma." "I know," she sighed. "And that's what makes this so hard. I don't want to make the wrong decision, Dan. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I've made a mistake I can't undo." There was a long pause, the silence between us filled with all the unspoken words that had been lingering since she left. I could hear the emotion in her voice, and it stirred something deep within me, an old familiar ache that I thought I'd buried. But I couldn't let myself get caught up in that, not again. "Lisa, we're both hurting," I said softly. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe we need to let ourselves feel this, to accept that things have changed. I don't know if we can go back to what we had, and honestly, I'm not sure that's even what we should be trying to do." Her silence on the other end of the line told me she was considering my words, weighing them against her own thoughts. "I guess you're right," she finally said, her voice small. "It's just hard, letting go of the past." "It is," I agreed, "but we've got to keep moving forward for Emma's sake. We need to focus on being the best parents we can be, even if we're not together anymore." There was another pause, and when she spoke again, I could hear the resolve in her voice. "You're right. We need to focus on Emma. She's what matters most." For the first time in a long while, it felt like we were on the same page. We weren't trying to fix our marriage or rekindle what we'd lost. We were accepting that this was our new reality and that we had to make the best of it. We talked for a while longer, discussing logistics, upcoming school events, and how we could make the transition easier for Emma. It was a practical conversation, devoid of the emotion that had clouded so many of our recent interactions. And in a way, it was a relief. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. We weren't fixed, and we probably never would be. But we were working together, and that was something. The next morning, as I got ready for work, I found myself thinking about Lisa's words from the night before. There was a time when I would have clung to the hope that we could fix everything, that we could go back to the way things were. But now I realized I didn't need that anymore. I was learning to accept the choices we'd made and the consequences that came with them. I was learning to let go of the past, to focus on the future, even if it wasn't the future I'd once envisioned. Later that day, I picked up Emma from school. As we walked home, she chattered excitedly about her day, her little hand warm in mine. As I listened to her, I found myself smiling, genuinely smiling for the first time in a long while. Life was far from perfect, but it was moving forward, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. When we got home, I made dinner, and we sat down together at the table, just the two of us. Emma talked about her friends, her school projects, and the upcoming weekend. And as I watched her, I realized that this simple, everyday moment was what really mattered. Lisa and I had made our choices, and now we had to live with them. But we could still build something good out of the pieces that were left. For Emma's sake and for our own. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at me with her big, trusting eyes and asked, "Daddy, are you happy?" I paused for a moment, thinking about her question. Was I happy? It was a complicated question, with no easy answer. But as I looked at my daughter, I realized that at this moment, I was content. And that was a start. "I'm getting there, sweetheart," I said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm getting there." The weeks that followed were a blur of routine and responsibility. Every day I found myself navigating the fine line between co-parenting and holding on to what little remained of my life with Lisa. We were both trying our best to make things work for Emma, but the unspoken tension between us was always there, lingering in the background. One evening, after I had put Emma to bed, I found myself alone in the living room, staring at the stack of papers I had brought home from work. The familiar pressure of deadlines and tasks loomed over me, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved, something that I needed to confront. As if on cue, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I picked it up and there it was, a text from Lisa. "Can we meet? There's something I need to talk to you about." I stared at the message for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't about Emma or logistics. This was something else, something more final. "Okay," I replied, trying to keep my own emotions in check. "Where?" We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop halfway between our places. It was neutral territory, a space that didn't hold the memories of our life together. As I drove there, I couldn't help but wonder what she wanted to say. Part of me already knew, but I wasn't ready to fully accept it. When I arrived, Lisa was already there, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She looked up as I walked in, offering a small, tentative smile. I sat down across from her, trying to read her expression, but she was guarded as always. "Thanks for meeting me," she said softly. "Of course," I replied, my voice steady. "What's on your mind?" She took a deep breath, glancing down at her coffee before finally meeting my eyes. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About everything, about us, about where we go from here." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. This was it. The moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "I know we've both tried to make this work," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "We've tried to co-parent, to be civil, to move on, but I think we both know that it's not enough. Not for me and not for you." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. "What are you saying, Lisa?" She hesitated for a moment as if searching for the right words. "I'm saying that I think it's time for us to let go. Really let go. I don't want to keep holding on to something that's not there anymore. It's not fair to either of us." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't argue with her. Deep down, I had known this was coming. We had been holding on to the hope that we could salvage something from the wreckage, but the truth was, our marriage was beyond saving. "So you're saying it's over," I said quietly, more as a statement than a question. Lisa nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think it is, Dan. I think we both need to move on, for real this time. It's the only way we're going to find any peace." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. This was the end of the road, the final decision. There was no going back now, but strangely, as the reality of it settled over me, I felt a sense of relief. The uncertainty, the constant questioning, the lingering what-ifs, they were all finally coming to an end. I guess you're right," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "We've both been trying to hold on to something that isn't there anymore. Maybe it's time to let go." Lisa reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything we'd been through together. The love, the pain, the loss. "I'll always care about you, Dan," she said softly. "You're Emma's father, and you've been a huge part of my life, but I think it's time for us to find our own paths. Separately." I nodded, squeezing her hand gently before letting go. "I care about you too, Lisa, and I want you to be happy, whatever that looks like." We sat in silence for a while, the finality of our decision hanging in the air between us. There was a sense of closure, but also a quiet sadness. This wasn't how either of us had imagined our lives turning out, but it was the reality we had to face. Eventually, we both stood up, ready to leave. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no tearful farewells. Just a quiet understanding that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. As I walked out of the coffee shop and into the cool night air, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a hint of hope. The future was uncertain, but at least now I knew where I stood. I could finally start to rebuild, to move forward, even if it wasn't the path I had originally envisioned. When I got home, I found Emma fast asleep in her bed, her little face peaceful and content. I stood there for a moment watching her, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of calm. No matter what happened between Lisa and me, I still had Emma. And that was enough. It had to be enough. I closed the door quietly behind me and walked into the living room, feeling the weight of the evening's events settle over me. It wasn't easy letting go, but it was the only way forward, and as difficult as it was, I knew it was the right choice. Tomorrow would be a new day, a chance to start fresh, to find my own way. And this time, I was ready to face it. The past was behind me, and the future was waiting. I just had to take that first step. The next morning, the weight of the previous night still lingered as I went through my routine. The decision Lisa and I had made sat heavy in my chest, but there was also a sense of finality that brought with it a strange kind of peace. It was over. There was no more hoping, no more trying to salvage something that couldn't be saved. Now, it was just about moving forward. As I sipped my coffee, I glanced over at the calendar on the wall. Emma had a school play coming up, her first one. I circled the date with a red marker, making a mental note to pick up some flowers for her on the way home that day. Small gestures, little moments, I knew those were the things that would matter most moving forward. When I got to work, the familiar hum of the office was a welcome distraction. I buried myself in tasks and meetings, letting the steady flow of work keep my mind occupied. But every now and then, thoughts of Lisa would creep in, moments we'd shared, the laughter, the arguments, the dreams we once had. And while those memories still stung, they didn't paralyze me the way they used to. I was learning to live with them, to let them be just that, memories. Later that evening, after picking up Emma from school, we sat down for dinner. She chattered away about her day, her excitement for the play palpable. As I listened to her, I found myself smiling, genuinely happy to be in that moment with her. She was my anchor now, the one constant in the sea of change that had become my life. "Daddy, are you coming to my play?" she asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Of course I am," I replied, reaching across the table to ruffle her hair. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." She beamed at me, her happiness contagious. And in that moment, I realized that while my marriage with Lisa had ended, my role as a father hadn't. In fact, it had become more important than ever. Emma needed me, and I needed her. The night of the play came quickly, and as I sat in the auditorium surrounded by other parents and the buzz of excitement, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Watching Emma up on that stage, confidently delivering her lines, I knew that despite everything that had happened, we were going to be okay. After the play, Lisa approached me in the crowd. We exchanged polite smiles and a few words about how well Emma had done. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just two parents sharing a moment of pride in their child. It was a glimpse of what our new relationship could be, one built on mutual respect and a shared love for Emma. As we parted ways that evening, I felt a shift within myself. I wasn't holding on to the past anymore. I wasn't angry or bitter or consumed by what could have been. I was ready to embrace the future, whatever it held. That night, after putting Emma to bed, I sat down in the living room, the quiet of the house comforting rather than oppressive. I thought about everything that had happened, the affair, the heartache, the decisions we'd made. It had all led me to this point, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of acceptance. Life wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But it was mine, and I was ready to live it on my own terms. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I also knew that I had the strength to face them. As I closed my eyes that night, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The future was still uncertain, but I was no longer afraid of it. I had my daughter, my work, and most importantly, I had myself. That was enough. The next morning, I woke up early, ready to start a new day. The sun was shining through the window, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt hopeful. There was a long road ahead, but I was ready to walk it, step by step, one day at a time. And with that thought, I smiled, knowing that whatever came next, I would be okay. It's been a few months since that night in the coffee shop. Life has settled into a new kind of normal, and though the pain of the past still lingers, it doesn't define me anymore. I've learned to coexist with it, letting it be a part of my story without letting it control me. Emma and I have found our rhythm. Weekends are filled with trips to the park, movie nights, and sometimes just lounging around the house doing nothing at all. She's adjusted better than I expected. Kids have a remarkable way of adapting to change, something I've tried to take a lesson from. Lisa and I communicate regularly, but it's purely about Emma now. There's no more tension, no more trying to navigate the remnants of our marriage. We're co-parents and we're doing our best for our daughter. That's all that matters. One Saturday afternoon, Emma and I were at the park. She was playing on the swings, her laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. I sat on a nearby bench watching her, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment. As I looked around, taking in the sights and sounds of the park, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. Not the kind of fleeting happiness that comes and goes, but a deep, steady sense of contentment. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was okay with that. "Daddy, watch this!" Emma's voice broke through my thoughts. I looked up to see her trying to jump off the swing mid-air, her little legs kicking out as she flew through the air and landed on the soft grass with a triumphant grin. I laughed, clapping my hands. "That was awesome, Emma." She ran over to me, her cheeks flushed from the exertion, and plopped down next to me on the bench. "Did you see me? I was flying." "You were," I agreed, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. "You're a regular stunt woman." She giggled, leaning into me, and for a moment we just sat there in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. "Daddy," she said after a while, her voice quiet, "are you happy?" The question took me by surprise. I looked down at her, her big brown eyes searching mine for an answer. Kids have a way of asking the simplest questions that hit the hardest. I thought about it for a moment, really considered it. Was I happy? After everything that had happened, could I say that I was? "Yes, Emma," I said finally, my voice steady. "I am happy. And you know what? You make me the happiest of all." She smiled, satisfied with my answer, and snuggled closer. And in that moment, I realized that it was true. Despite everything, the heartbreak, the loss, the uncertainty, I had found happiness again. It wasn't the happiness I had once envisioned, but it was real, and it was mine. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the park, I felt a sense of closure. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't define my future. I had Emma, I had myself, and I had the strength to keep moving forward. Later that night, after putting Emma to bed, I sat down in my favorite chair with a book in hand. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel empty but now felt peaceful. I opened the book, letting myself get lost in the story, but my mind kept drifting back to the events of the past year. It had been a journey, a painful, messy, complicated journey, but I had made it through, and now standing on the other side I felt stronger for it. The future still held uncertainties, but I no longer feared them. I was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that I had the resilience to handle it. As I turned the pages of my book, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good, and that was enough. In the end, it wasn't about getting back to where I was before. It was about moving forward, creating a new path for myself and for Emma. A path that wasn't defined by the past but shaped by the choices I made every day. And so, as I sat there, the weight of the past finally lifting from my shoulders, I allowed myself to smile. It was a new beginning, a new chapter in my life, and this time, I was ready to write it. With time, the wounds from the past began to heal, and life found a way of moving forward. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Each passing day brought a new sense of stability, a feeling that life was starting to settle into a new, comfortable rhythm. One Friday evening, I found myself preparing dinner while Emma worked on a school project at the kitchen table. The sound of her pencil scratching against paper was comforting background noise, a reminder of how far we had come. "Dad, can you help me with this?" Emma asked, her voice pulling me from my thoughts. I looked over at her, seeing the frustration on her face as she struggled with a math problem. It was a sight that just a few months ago would have sent me into a spiral of worry about being a good enough father. But now it just felt like part of our routine, something we could handle together. "Sure thing, Em," I said, setting down the knife and walking over to her. We spent the next few minutes going over the problem, and when she finally understood it, the smile on her face was more than enough reward. "Thanks, Dad," she said, giving me a quick hug before returning to her work. As I went back to preparing dinner, I thought about how much things had changed. The chaos and uncertainty that had once defined our lives had gradually given way to something more peaceful, more manageable. And with that change came a new perspective, a realization that life doesn't have to be perfect to be good. That night, after dinner, Emma and I settled onto the couch to watch a movie. It had become something of a tradition for us, our little way of unwinding at the end of a long week. As we watched the screen, her head resting on my shoulder, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of contentment. This was our life now, and I was grateful for it. When the movie ended, I tucked Emma into bed, listening as she told me about her plans for the weekend. It was nothing elaborate, just playing with her friends, maybe going to the park, but it was enough. As I kissed her goodnight, I felt a surge of pride in how strong and resilient she had become. After she fell asleep, I found myself sitting on the back porch, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring up at the stars. The night was calm, the air cool against my skin. It was one of those rare moments of complete tranquility, where everything feels right with the world. As I sat there, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. The betrayal, the anger, the pain, it had all been part of the process, a necessary step in finding my way back to myself. And though it had been hard, I knew now that I had come out stronger on the other side. Lisa and I had found our way to a place of mutual respect, and while we would never be what we once were, we had managed to build something new, a co-parenting relationship that worked for both of us and, most importantly, for Emma. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was enough. As I finished my drink and made my way back inside, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. The past was behind me, and the future, whatever it held, was something I was ready to face. The next morning, I woke up early as I often did these days, and found myself going for a run. The streets were quiet, the world still waking up around me. As I moved through the familiar paths, I felt the tension in my body ease, my mind clearing with each step. Running had become my therapy, a way to release stress and find clarity. When I returned home, I found Emma already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal. She looked up and smiled as I walked in, and I couldn't help but smile back. This was our life now. A simple, quiet existence that brought me more joy than I ever could have imagined. Later that day, as we headed out for our usual weekend activities, I felt a sense of anticipation for the future. There were still challenges ahead, of course, there always would be. But I no longer feared them. I had learned to trust myself, to trust that I could handle whatever came my way. Most importantly, I had learned to find happiness in the little things, in Emma's laughter, in the quiet moments of solitude, in the knowledge that I had built a life that was worth living. As we drove down the road, the sun shining brightly overhead, I glanced over at Emma. Her face lit up with excitement as she talked about her plans for the day. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. The future was uncertain, but I was ready for it. Whatever came next, I knew that I had the strength, the resilience, and the love to face it head on. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. Life had settled into a steady rhythm, one that I had grown comfortable with. Emma and I had our routines and our little traditions, and every day felt a little easier than the last. I was finally beginning to believe that the worst was behind us, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One Saturday afternoon, I took Emma to her favorite ice cream shop. It was one of those small, cozy places that had been around for decades, the kind of spot where the staff knew your name and your order by heart. Emma always went for the same thing, strawberry with rainbow sprinkles, and I usually got black coffee ice cream. As we walked in, the familiar smell of waffle cones and sugar hit us, and Emma immediately ran up to the counter to order. I hung back, letting her have her moment of independence. The shop was crowded, full of families and kids enjoying their weekend treats. I smiled, feeling content in the buzz of life around me. That's when I saw her. Lisa. She was sitting at one of the tables near the window, a cup of coffee in front of her. She wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man I didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed with an easy smile. They were deep in conversation, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. For a moment, I froze. It was the first time I had seen her with someone else since our separation, and it hit me harder than I expected. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a sharp pang of something that felt like loss, mixed with the realization that we had both moved on. Emma hadn't noticed them yet. She was too busy chatting with the cashier, deciding on extra toppings for her ice cream. I considered turning around and leaving, avoiding the situation altogether, but something kept me rooted in place. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the need to confront this new reality head-on. Lisa must have sensed someone watching her because she looked up and our eyes met. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Then she gave me a small, tentative smile, one that I returned, though it felt strained. The man she was with noticed our exchange and glanced over at me, his expression polite but curious. I took a deep breath and walked over to them. There was no point in avoiding it now. "Hey Lisa," I said, keeping my tone light. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Hi Dan," she replied, her voice soft. "Yeah, I wasn't expecting this either." There was an awkward pause, the kind that happens when two people who used to know each other so well suddenly find themselves as strangers. I could feel the man's eyes on me, and I decided to break the tension. "I'm Dan," I said, extending my hand. "Nice to meet you." He stood up, shaking my hand firmly. "Mike," he introduced himself. "Nice to meet you too." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. This was new territory for me and I wasn't quite sure how to navigate it. Lisa seemed to sense my discomfort because she quickly added, "Mike and I work together. We just came here for a quick coffee." "Got it," I replied, feeling a strange mix of relief and something else I couldn't quite name. "Well, I'll let you get back to it. I'm here with Emma, getting our usual treat." At the mention of Emma, Lisa's face softened. "Is she here? I'd love to say hi." I hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "Yeah, she's at the counter." Lisa stood up and we both made our way over to Emma, who was just finishing up her order. When she saw her mom, her face lit up with surprise and happiness. "Mom," she exclaimed, running over to give Lisa a hug. "What are you doing here?" "Just having coffee with a friend," Lisa said, smiling down at her. "But I'm glad I ran into you. How's your day going?" They chatted for a bit, and I stood off to the side watching them. It was a strange feeling, seeing them together like this, knowing that our family was no longer what it once was. But there was also a sense of peace in it, a realization that, despite everything, we were still connected through Emma. Eventually, Lisa said her goodbyes and went back to her table with Mike. Emma and I found a seat on the other side of the shop, and she happily dug into her ice cream, oblivious to the emotional roller coaster I had just been on. As I watched her enjoy her treat, I couldn't help but reflect on the encounter. It hadn't been easy, but it also hadn't been as difficult as I had feared. Seeing Lisa with someone else had been a shock, but it had also been a reminder that life goes on. We were both moving forward in our own ways. Later that night, after Emma was asleep, I found myself thinking about the day's events. There was no denying that seeing Lisa with someone else had stirred up emotions I thought I had dealt with. But as I sat there, alone with my thoughts, I realized that it was just another step in the healing process. We were both finding our way, and that was okay. I didn't need to have all the answers right now. What mattered was that I was learning to let go of the past and embrace whatever came next. And as I lay down to sleep that night, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Life was unpredictable, but I was ready for it, whatever it brought my way. Weeks passed since the unexpected encounter with Lisa and Mike at the ice cream shop. Life continued its steady rhythm, but I couldn't shake the lingering thoughts that followed. Seeing Lisa with someone else had stirred something in me, a mixture of nostalgia, acceptance, and the finality of our separation. But it also sparked a realization: I needed to fully let go, not just for Emma, but for myself. It was a Saturday morning when I made the decision. Emma was at a sleepover, and I found myself alone in the house. The silence was deafening, the kind that usually made me restless, but today it felt different. Today it felt like an opportunity. I walked into the spare room, the room that had once been Lisa's office. After she moved out, I left it untouched, a shrine to the life we once shared. But now, as I stood in the doorway, I knew it was time to reclaim the space. It was time to create something new, something that belonged to me. I started by packing up the few remaining items Lisa had left behind: books, papers, and a few photos. As I placed them in a box, memories flooded back: the laughter we once shared, the plans we made, the life we built together. But those memories no longer felt like weights pulling me down. Instead, they felt like chapters of a book I had finished reading, a book that, while important, no longer defined who I was. Once the room was cleared out, I stood in the empty space, thinking about what it could become. A home office? A workout room? Maybe even a space for my hobbies, the ones I had put on hold for so long. The possibilities felt endless, and for the first time in a while I felt excited about the future. Later that day I went out to buy paint. I chose a calming shade of blue, something that felt peaceful yet vibrant, a reflection of the new chapter I was starting. As I painted the walls, I felt a sense of renewal wash over me. Each stroke of the brush was like a step forward, a move away from the past and toward the life I was creating for myself. By the time I finished, the room felt completely transformed. It was no longer a reminder of what was lost, but a symbol of what was to come. I stood back and admired my work, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This space was mine now, and it represented my journey, the pain, the healing, the growth. That evening, Emma came home from her sleepover. She ran into the house, her energy filling the space as she excitedly told me about her night with her friends. I listened, smiling, grateful for the joy she brought into my life. "Dad, what did you do while I was gone?" she asked, noticing the paint on my hands. "I worked on the spare room," I said, leading her upstairs to show her. When she saw the newly painted walls, her eyes lit up. "It looks so different. I love the color." "Thanks, Em," I replied, feeling a swell of pride. "I thought it was time for a change." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's nice, Dad. It feels happy." Happy. The word hung in the air, and I realized she was right. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. Not just content or resigned, but truly happy with where I was and where I was headed. As the days went by, that feeling only grew stronger. I started using the new room as a creative space, a place where I could write, paint, or just sit and think. It became a sanctuary, a reminder of the journey I had taken and the strength I had found along the way. Lisa and I continued to co-parent Emma, and our relationship, while different, had settled into a comfortable rhythm. We were no longer husband and wife, but we were still connected through our daughter, and that was enough. One afternoon, as I sat in my new space, Emma came in with a smile on her face. "Dad, can we go to the park later?" "Of course," I replied, putting down my pen. "Let's go now." We spent the afternoon at the park, just the two of us, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. As I watched Emma play, her laughter filling the air, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life hadn't turned out the way I had planned, but it had brought me to a place of peace, a place where I could be happy again. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, I realized that I had finally let go of the past. I had embraced the present and was ready to face whatever the future held. And in that moment, I knew that I had truly moved on. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led me here, to this place of calm, of happiness, of acceptance. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free to live, to love, to embrace the future with open arms. And that, more than anything, was the greatest gift of all.